Good evening and a warm welcome to one and all present here. I am Adya Chandrasekhar, Research Assistant at the Peninsula Foundation. We are very delighted to host this event today titled De-Dollarisation and the Emerging World Order. Is there a power shift? Our President, Air Marshal Dr. Madheshwaran, in conversation with Professor Arun Kumar, author, researcher, and former professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Welcome, sir. Before we begin, I would like to establish some ground rules. All participants are requested to kindly mute their audio throughout the discussion. And towards the end, the forum will be open to questions where you can engage either through the chat or using the raise hand option. Throughout the event, also participants can type out their comments or questions on the chat, which will be addressed during the Q&A session. Thank you. I now invite Air Marshal Dr. Madheshwaran to formally introduce our chief guest and commence the conversation. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Adya, and good evening to all of you. We've had a significant gap in our online events for some time, and we are restarting the whole process now. It gives me great pleasure to have Professor Arun Kumar this evening as our chief guest, and an important topic that's actually already animating the world, which is about de-dollarization and the emerging world order. Is there a power shift that is underway? And considering the fact that today the BRICS 15 summit is beginning, and it must have started, I suppose, one of the agenda points that is expected to be discussed is the introduction of the BRICS currency. And that's being seen in the world as something that's coming up. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our chief guest. Is Professor Arun Kumar. Is also our distinguished fellow. He is a well-known economist, author, and a researcher. And he's been the Sukhamoy Chakrabarti Chair Professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in Jawaharlal Nehru University till 2015. And later, he was taken over as the Malcolm Adisesha Chair Professor in the Institute of Social Sciences in New Delhi. He holds a PhD in economics from JNU and a master's in physics from Princeton University in the USA. His specialization is in development economics, public finance and public policy, and macroeconomics. He's a prolific writer, author, and speaker, and he's authored innumerable articles on the current economic status, on statistics, on research, and well-known books, particularly on the economy after COVID-19. Let me welcome Professor Arun Kumar. Formal welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
With the beginning of the war in Ukraine in February 24th last year, when Russia invaded and called it as a special military operation, this is a significant milestone in the global history, particularly in the context of what actually has led to that conflict and what is keeping that conflict going on for more than a year and a half now. And more importantly, the series of sanctions that the Western world had applied on Russia, the US-China animosity that has erupted after that, and of course, the rise of BRICS. All these are significant major developments. And that gives important points to understand that in the international relations and geopolitical analysis and history, power struggle and power transition theories are very strongly analyzed, very deeply analyzed. And this is seen as a moment of power struggle, power transition struggle between the West, led by the US, which has been dominating the world for now more than 3 centuries, ever since the colonial and imperial powers took control of the world and the world economy. And this is seen to be a major struggle as China has risen to challenge the US. Russia has re-emerged as a significant military and economic power. and the rise of India and the growth of non-Western world as well. So if we look at the historical process, the international order rests on three pillars. One is the politics and security pillar. The second is economics, or the most important one is economics. And the third one is, of course, the security and technological pillar. And these are controlled by the leading hegemon of the day. And the hegemon ensures that this hegemony is sustained through economic domination and use of its currency as a global reserve. This has been in the past, and it is there today as well. So up until the early 20th century, when the First World War started, British pound was the reserve currency, as the British Empire was strong in the 19th century, started declining, and then power transition took place to the US. The US dollar came into prominence, and post 1945 world has been constructed on the pillars that I've explained to you. So this is under challenge. In the 2000s, the US dollar dominated all the foreign exchange holdings of the entire world to the extent of 70%. Today, that's come down to 59%. It is still a major push. When we say de-dollarization is not going to happen overnight, it's going to be a process over the next 20 years. But the current events, few questions can be posed which are accelerating the de-dollarization process. One is the war in Ukraine. Second, when the US applied sanctions, unilateral sanctions bypassing the UN and other multilateral institutions, the trust in the US and the West has come down, and much of the global South or the non-Western countries have not gone along with these sanctions. So the trust factor is one major point. And the third is when the US confiscated $300 billion of Russian assets. That's given a big knock on the credibility of the US as a country with whom virtually the entire world had reposed faith in investment and in investing their dollars in the US security bonds. So this has taken a big hit, which is actually forcing countries to look at alternate ways and diversifying to ensure their risk against the dollar is minimized. So with these questions, I think we need to look at how the de-dollarization needs to be viewed as it comes prominently into the discussions today. And therefore, let me first invite Professor Arun Kumar to take 8 to 10 minutes to give an overview on this entire analysis with related to these questions, and then we'll get into our conversation. Professor, all yours.
Thank you, Marshal Matheswaran, for inviting me here in your midst on this very important subject. So I'll just make a few points given the time. One is that globalization itself is reversing. And the reversal of globalization, along with that goes the de-dollarization that you are talking about. And as you rightly said, it's not going to happen right away. It will take some time for the process of de-dollarization to work itself out. So what are the challenges that are faced? First is that a new Cold War has begun. Unlike the old Cold War, which was between two ideological blocs, the current Cold War is between two capitalist blocs. I see Russia and China also as capitalist nations. They're not really socialist or communist nations. So this new power shift that you are talking about is taking place in the context of the Cold War between these two capitalist blocs. And I think it is about resources. It's about long-term capture of resources by the two segments, So the rich nations headed by the USA are on the one hand, and China and Russia are on the other hand. And USA has been worried, not only now, but for some time, by the rapid rise of China. It has put into place a number of alliances like the Quad, etc., for quite some time. The other, also groupings to contain China. It has now curtailed the flow of high technology items to China, which is very significant because that is a kind of a signal that it does not want China to continue to advance the way it has been advancing. China has also been very aggressive. It has tried to expand its global footprint in its neighborhood, in South China Sea, etc. It's using the Belt and Road Initiative to expand its market into Africa, Europe, and other parts. So the Chinese have also been very, very aggressive in this. The war in Ukraine, which according to a recent report in the New York Times, suggests that there have been already 5 lakh casualties. In other words, the costs are very high, and yet it is going on. And the West is fueling, on the one hand, and Russian adventurism is preventing it from coming to an agreement. So both sides are hell-bent on continuing with this. And this war has the potential of spinning out of control. We don't know, now the F-16s are also being supplied. If the Russians begin to suffer as a result of, the more advanced weapons that are being supplied, what will its, impact be on, what will its impact be remains to be seen. The only beneficiary is the military-industrial complex, because armament is being used on a very large scale. So armament production is going to be taking place on a very, very large scale. Now, on the other hand, if you see Russia and China, they are facing the challenge that both are facing the challenge, and therefore there is no option for them but to get together. So I think, the problem that is that the Russians have a certain amount of technology, the Chinese have the economic power, and the two together can be a very formidable challenge to the rich nations. India has been taking a middle path because militarily it depends on supplies both from Russia and from the West. So it's not able to take sides in the conflict. It is trying to say that this is not the era of war, and therefore trying to sort of mediate in the meanwhile. Now, all this, as you rightly put, the strategic aspects will play themselves out in the long run and not just the immediate short run. So we have to look at what the long run implications are, because even de-dollarization will happen in the long run. So the economic disruptions that are going to be playing out will be that globalization will be truncated, because globalization was all about trade, finance, and technology exchanges. Now, those are going to slow down. Already, as you rightly pointed out, there is the sanction on Russia, on its finances being frozen, etc. So therefore, supply chains are likely to shorten further. Supply chains are being shortened by the COVID crisis, and the financial movements which are getting affected. New financial relationships are being created where, instead of the Western dominated financial transactions, now there'll be also other sources of transfer of funds that are emerging. Now, what will happen is that the world economy was impacted by COVID, and that will be further impacted. And I think the slowdown in the world economy will take place over a period of time as a result of the impact on trade, finance, and on technology transfers. So the impact will be the most on the marginalized sections of the world. It will not be on the richer sections, but along with this problem, we have the climate change problem. The climate change problem is also impacting the GDP of the world. It's, the extreme weather events are rising in number, as we can see this year, the last year, and the year before. Places which were cool are now going up to 40, 45 degrees Celsius. Places which had not seen floods are seeing floods, and so on and so forth. There is also the challenge of the rapid technological change, the introduction of artificial intelligence, and the Chat GPT and other such large language things that are coming up. Now, this will impact employment generation, both in the advanced countries and the backward and the developing countries. And the workers will therefore suffer unemployment, which will again react back on the situation of various countries. But now with the artificial intelligence, it is not just the unskilled workers, even skilled workers are going to be impacted, as is being suggested that the need for teachers will decline. The need for other, skilled people like doctors, etc., will also decline. So the link of disruptions with de-globalization. Sorry, my phone started ringing. So the disruption will cause nations to retreat from globalization, and each will try to protect its market and jobs. So this de-globalization and de-dollarization are interlinked. Now, dollar had enabled greater trade and finance because it provided a platform which was the basis of trade and finance in the world. And with these two blocks emerging, the position of the dollar will weaken because there will be a whole block which will move away. Just like during the Cold War, there was a block, the Soviet bloc, which was not using dollar, etc. So similarly, this will happen. And as you rightly said, it will take time for it to happen. And therefore, a new financial architecture will emerge. Now, the rise of China, which has been threatening the dominance of the US economy and of dollar, this will be further impacted by this alternate block which is getting created. Because now this alternate block will develop its own kind of, currency transfers, etc. The Chinese economy of late has been seeing problems that are emerging, and that's why the economy is slowing down, the Chinese economy, the problem of consumption there, the problem of declining trade, that is happening. And I think in all this, the rich nations are playing a role. When they're denying technology to China, etc., that's impacting the Chinese economy and its capacity to produce more, and that is then slowing it down. The US has benefited enormously from dollarization of the world economy. It has been getting interest-free loan from the rest of the world because people are holding dollars. About $1 trillion are lying abroad. So that's like a $1 trillion loan to the US economy. It's able to have a high deficit in the budget, which means that savings are flowing in from the rest of the world. People are buying US bonds and treasuries, etc., which is again a loan to the US economy. And therefore, it can run a very large deficit in the trade account of about almost $1 trillion. That means the American economy benefits through the inflow of cheap imports. It benefits because it's able to get savings from the rest of the world, and from the dollarization, it is able to get. So the US economy has benefited enormously. Its living standard depends on the dollarization of the economy. So when de-dollarization takes place, then countries will hold less of dollars. As you rightly pointed out earlier, the reserves were 70% in dollars. Now it's come down to 59%. As the trust declines and as alternate mechanisms are put in place, India is also trying to develop escrow accounts with some of the countries so that it can import in local currency rather than in dollars. Now, that would mean that the dollar's value will decline. When people hold less dollar will return back to the US and its value would decline. And then it will no more be a safe passage, it no more be a safe haven. And once the safe haven character declines, then the people will move away more from the dollar. The dollar will further decline. That will also lead to a decline in consumption in the US because consumption is based on imports, and that will decline. The only thing that will increase there is the military expenditure on armament production, etc. It will not be able to hold large number of bases, which, as you rightly pointed out, there are 800 bases that the US has abroad. That requires foreign exchange. And with the foreign exchange not available, I think holding bases will also be. So its military power and its economic power will be affected. Now, the interesting thing is what will be the developing world's reaction? The developing world will be between the two Cold War power blocks, like earlier. And therefore, they'll have more space for following policies that would be beneficial to them. So in a sense, it gives greater space for the developing world to this thing. But what will happen globally is that there are huge uncertainties that are developing. And when there are uncertainties, investments decline. When the investments decline, then of course, the rate of growth of the economy also declines. So, the problem that will come is that the developing world will have to develop its own internal strength because it will not be able to depend on the trade to boost itself. So external markets and external support will be very weak. And therefore, the internal markets have to be developed by whether it be India or be other nations. China is already trying to do that, shift to more consumption away from what it had very high level of saving and investment so that it can boost its own growth. Now, technology will be the biggest challenge because the whole point about globalization is technology. Those who possess higher technology, they dominate in the world. So developing world will have to develop technology, and India's technology development has been very weak. We only spend 0.7% of GDP on R&D, whereas other nations spend 2, 3, 4, 5%, up to 5% like Israel. So technology development we have to do if we want to develop internal strengths. We can see that we've been importing armament because our own technology is rather weak at the moment. So technology development will be a very big challenge as far as India is concerned. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor. I mean, you mentioned about the dollar being, still in a very strong position, even though it's come down to 59% of foreign exchange reserves, all countries. But then in terms of, countries investing in bonds and holding dollars, there are multiple ways of trade-related investments and trade-related holdings, which actually take the overall domination of the dollar to almost 80% even today. Right. So how did such a dominant position of the dollar come about? I mean, this is before we actually go deep into de-dollarization. I think people must understand, how did the dollarization come about? Is it a carefully constructed geopolitical strategy, or is it accident, or is it both? Combination of both. For example, the events that took place in the two world wars and how America benefited from that. And then, of course, the post-Second World War construction of the Bretton Woods system. And then, of course, Nixon's masterstroke, where he de-linked the dollar from the gold standard and made the dollar pretty much equivalent to the gold for everybody else and forced the petrodollar. So are these coerced, construction of a geopolitical strategy that the US has been so successful at it? And now when that is being, challenged, has that been the reason for the wars that the US has perpetuated since 1991?
I think you have already spelt out how the dollar rose. The Second World War weakened all other developed nations, the rich nations, and the US provided Marshall aid to Europe to rebuild it. It was the dominant power in the world at that point of time. Even though the Soviet Union had come up, but the Soviet power was nowhere comparable. And also, in terms of the two blocks, it was not the power that was fueling the growth of the developed world and the developing world. So in a sense, what was happening was that the US could dominate in terms of economic, military, and other things. It was also the guarantor of the military power for the developed world to prevent it from turning communist. So NATO, CETO, CENTO, and all that how these were created to prevent the expansion of communism. In fact, the Vietnam War itself was a way to see that the domino effect doesn't take place, where the fear was that Vietnam would fall, then Laos and Cambodia would fall, and then Thailand and Burma, and then India would also fall. So in a sense, the West realized the danger of communism spreading, and the West, therefore, what it did was it bolstered, military power. Economically, it was already very strong. It had technology, which the others didn't have, and therefore, it could dominate the world right from the beginning. But as you said, the Bretton Woods institutions were created in 1944 at Bretton Woods so that the domination of the Western powers could continue. So therefore, what they did was trade, development. So the World Bank was for development, trade, and IMF for the monetary aspect. So these three institutions were created so that they could dominate over the entire world. So right from the Second World War onward, it was that the Western powers would dominate the entire global scenario, militarily, economically, and so on. So this was the design that had already been created on the basis of the strength of US post the Second World War. Now, when you say that dollarization also was accelerated by Nixon moving away from the gold standard, that was bound to happen. If you remember, De Gaulle was shipping, dollars and wanting gold from Fort Knox to come to France. And, the world economy had expanded so much that gold could not be the gold could not be the defining way of currencies underlying the currencies. So in a sense, that move had to take place at some point. If you had stuck to the gold standard, then there was not going to be enough for trade and for investment, etc. So that was bound to happen. Now, in that situation, dollar was the only currency that could play a role of some kind of a reserve currency. So a reserve currency is required basically to underlie what's going on. Other currencies can fluctuate, but the dollar becomes the standard by which those fluctuations are looked at, by which your trade, etc., is denominated. And especially in the 1970s, when the oil trade was taking place, at that point of time, there was the petrodollars. If you remember, the petrodollars were because the OPEC countries were generating huge surpluses because they were supplying oil to the rest of the world, and they were getting a lot of currency. So petrodollars was a way of recycling. Whatever was being spent, it was being recycled in dollars. So that further strengthened it, and therefore more and more trade got denominated in dollars. So all this put together, the dollar kept on getting strengthened. And then the finance world was also controlled from London and from New York. And that control meant that, dollar again was the currency of choice for the world of finance. So as you rightly said, that even now 80% or so of the world of finance moves in the dollars. And that depends on the trust. Now, when the de-dollarization takes place, this trust is breaking down. And secondly, when China has become a major part, in PPP terms, it's already ahead of USA. But even in nominal dollars, it's come close to the USA. And in trade, it has become the largest trader in the world in terms of exports and imports. So the power of China has risen dramatically in the last 10 years. Post the financial crisis of 2007-9, and therefore China is posing a problem. And because politically also it's aggressive, and the US is trying to restrict it, as I said. So all that put together, the de-dollarization process has begun with the rise of China, with the new Cold War that has taken place, and where, as you said, the trust in dollar has declined because there can be sanctions imposed, like sanctions were imposed on Iran also, now on Russia, earlier on Cuba and on Venezuela, etc. So, there is always a danger that, that could happen to other countries also if you fall foul of the US. So therefore, the trust factor, which is very important for a currency to be a reserve currency, once that declines, then the de-dollarization process begins. So you're absolutely right in your analysis that this whole scheme of making dollar the center pin of the global finance and the global trade, that began with the Bretton Woods institutions, and that kept on going further because there's no substitute for it.
Absolutely. In fact, I just want to take on from where you've explained the Nixon's decision to delink the gold standard. At the end of the Second World War, the US held the maximum amount of gold, and the entire European empires were all demolished. So here was a situation where the US could actually build its empire, and that's exactly what it did. If you agree with me. But once the dollar holdings were now being traded by the European countries, and now they began asking for the gold, and the gold stocks were depleting, the US had to find out a solution for that. But forcing the oil-producing countries to sell their oil in dollars alone, which is the petrodollar, how was that achieved? Is that a coercion? Just providing security umbrella was not the only, attractive process for them. I think there's been a fair amount of arm twisting by which they fell in line. And the petrodollar was actually the most important decision that strengthened the dollar. Am I right in concluding that way?
Yes, the petroleum supplying countries also really had very little option, because the dollar was the most stable currency at that point of time. So therefore, they agreed to it. And then, of course, the security umbrella, as you said, in the West Asian region was being provided by, the US, and the biggest of them, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, etc. They were under the US umbrella. So they readily agreed to this dollarization. So it was seen to be in the mutual interest, just as, in the recent period, China has had more than $3 trillion of reserves, of which almost $1 trillion are in US treasuries. And therefore, it was in China's interest also to see the US dollar did not decline, because then its own reserves would have also declined. So in a sense, you get boxed in. Given the dollar's position, given the the US's position in international trade and finance, people get boxed in. Therefore, it was an easy thing. It's only now that there is a Cold War, there is a disruption in the global situation of trade and finance, that now people are thinking of alternatives. But till recently, people are not even thinking of an alternative to the dollar. It's only in the recent phase that the people are thinking of an alternative. So in a sense, most central banks willingly accepted to use dollar as the main reserve currency. They of course held yen and they of course had euro, etc., but in small quantities. So in a sense, it's a combination of the fact that US was the dominant power and the fact that it was the easiest thing to do to hold your reserves in dollars, that even the petrodollars, that recycling of dollars and petroleum, that could take place.
But I think the petroleum exporting countries realized that quite soon in the 80s and early 90s. And therefore, Saddam Hussein was the classic example who actually began challenging the imposition of petrodollars, and he wanted to change that to euros. The rise of euros was also seen as a challenge to the dollar dominance at one point of time when it was introduced. And similarly, the US played a cohesive role in dollarizing countries like Ecuador. Argentina is a classic example where there is enough studies that are now coming out which says in the 1990s, late 1990s to 2004 timeframe, when Argentina was in deep trouble, the IMF, the US experts advised the IMF, and IMF posed conditions in which they changed their dollar holdings to pesos, which led to further depression and a collapse of the economy. So there are enough evidence that's coming out. So Libya is a case that's being cited now as being punished for actually thinking about an African currency on a gold standard. Similarly, the wars in the war on global terror is actually now being seen in a different light. All this is the result of the Ukrainian conflict. Fundamentally, is a hegemon when he reaches a certain position of and peaks in terms of its economic capabilities, military power, and then history proves that every hegemon comes down in a decline. And when the decline is being looked at, you have behavior of hegemons in history that actually tends to resort to wars as a way of sustaining their hegemony. That's been there to some extent in the British model, as well as now it is very clearly seen in the US model. How will this change now that you've actually clearly explained about China's rise? And China has played a very intelligent game. They're not in a hurry. And I think we are only seeing the announcements that are coming in recent time, but I think they've been at it since the last 10 to 15 years. And they don't want to keep holding on to $3 trillion of US Treasury bonds. They want to now change all that to tangible assets which are going to be beneficial to them. And I believe the BRI is an excellent strategy for that entire process. How do you look at these angles of de-dollarization process?
So you are right that, the US has used the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO to dominate over the world. And, the conditionalities that are levied by these institutions on countries that are facing balance of payment problems, those conditionalities also strengthen the Western powers, because ultimately the voting pattern in the IMF and the World Bank is in favor of the developed countries. So they're able to impose, the conditionalities which will strengthen these countries and their interests. And that partly is also to keep the dollar as a dominant currency in the world. You're also right that in Latin America, the US has played a very important role in controlling Latin America. Latin America has been its sphere of influence. It has not allowed others to enter that sphere of influence. So there it's able to coerce regimes into doing what it would like to do. But of late, as you see, the left-wing regimes have come up in Latin America, whether it be in Brazil, Lula's coming, or in other countries, Venezuela, and so on, Ecuador, Peru, etc. They've had, because there's been a reaction to this kind of dominance. where Latin America faced a huge flight of capital. The elite in Latin America was taking its capital out to Europe and to the US. That left the countries in a very dire situation. They were developing countries, they were already upper middle income countries, but they could not transit to being rich countries as a result of all this. So in a sense, the US has played an important role in all this. US continues to play an important role. And as you said, in West Asia, whether it be Libya or Iraq, they were reacting to the dominance that was there of the US. And therefore, the US, has dethroned these regimes and destabilized many of the countries in West Asia. So there are wars that have resulted as a result of they're trying to be independent, rather than be under the Western hegemony. Now with China, it's different because China has gathered huge strength in the last 40 years, in terms of the military, in terms of the strategic, in terms of economic power. And that US is finding difficult. It cannot, easily destabilize. You're also right that, in Asia, there was talk in the 90s of an Asian monetary union, just like the European Union and a Eurozone currency. But USA has never encouraged either the Euro or the Asian monetary union for developing an Asian currency. Because the moment, big currencies like that come, like Euro or Asian currency, that would undermine the dollar. So it has not been encouraged. Also, I think Japan, which was rising very dramatically in the 80s, suddenly in the 90s onward, its rise was stalled. And I think somewhere there's a role of the US in the fact that the Japanese rise got stalled. Its growth got stalled. Similarly, now China's growth is getting stalled because of what the US is doing in terms of technology, in terms of trade and finance. So the US has the levers of power, whether it be the international institutions, whether it be the international banks and so on, through which it can, apply the levers of power so as to prevent, or get its own way, which is to prevent others from rising and challenging it. So definitely, all this is playing in the background. The US has the power at this point of time to do all this, and it's using those instruments to actually do it. So when you say that it can even create wars, that of course is there, that on some pretext or the other, it can create wars. It can talk about democracy and strengthening democracy in certain countries, and therefore encouraging internal dissent to take place and for regimes to be changed. So there is a huge US interference in the political sphere of various countries, which can be utilized at the right time to create conditions where it can intervene, whether politically or in military terms. So the US definitely has that kind of capacity to do all this.
That's the capitalist model when you say the US ability to interfere. And while it, in the name of democracy, it encourages private industry and private investments to be encouraged and developed by governments. So what happens, is that true if I say that the elites have been attracted to invest in the US and in the US dollars? And that's been a problem with many of the non-Western countries, including India to some extent. And therefore, the US has had an advantage of sort of, making sure that much of the world depends on the dollar. Japan has not been able to get out of, as you pointed out about the 1990s case, where the yen was forced to be devalued. And Japan's rise was virtually, brought to a halt by the US. But that both Japan and Germany are still, the US has enormous influence on them simply because of the history of being defeated states, having been occupied, and certain amount of control as allies. But with China, China has understood this history quite well. And while it has certain areas of technology to catch up, will this kind of interruption or disruption work in China, or the strategy of the US work in China?
Well, China has had a greater, independence in terms of policy making. It has pursued policies basically for its own benefit. Unlike, say, as you pointed out, Japan and Germany were defeated powers. There's a lot of US control over them over a period of time. They were supplied with aid and with technology, etc., so that they could come up as a bulwark against communism. So Russia is not, China is not in that same league as these nations. Plus, it's not a small nation like, say, Iraq or Libya, where the intervention can be very strong. Also, the political intervention in China is rather not easy. It's a huge nation. So it cannot be said that for promoting democracy, certain movements can be engineered in those countries so that there can be greater intervention. So China is in a completely different league. It has waited for its time for assertion. It has only started asserting itself after it had reached a certain economic strength and a military strength. And I think the Chinese leadership has always taken an independent position. Unlike in many other countries in the world, which are small countries where there's no independent line. And as we were discussing earlier, what has happened is that as soon as you go out of line, your trade imbalance increases, your balance of payment issues come up. And as a result, you have to seek assistance from the IMF and the World Bank. And the structural adjustment that is proposed by them actually goes in favor of the Western powers, because that's where the structural adjustment problems originate, and they provide the solution also. Now, as a result of all this, large part of the world has been under the hegemony of the US and the Western powers from the 1980s onward. These structural adjustment loans, etc., that have been there, they have actually put us in a position where we cannot go against them. And the elite in the developing world, its goal has been to globalize with the elite of the world. So it's not that that said in India that the average Indian is globalizing. It's the elite who want to globalize. And they, as a result, have been taking capital out of the country. There are 90 tax havens through which capital is taken out and invested, in the advanced countries. So, this global financial architecture has been created where even London is like a tax haven, New York is like a tax haven, Delaware in the USA is like a tax haven, where, you can do all kinds of manipulation of your finances and take capital out. And that's why London is a very prime, in a prime position where all the people who do various kinds of illegality, they escape to London and set up their base in London. So in a sense, this flight of capital has weakened the developing world. The rapid mobility of capital that has been enabled by this global financial architecture also means that the national governments weaken. Because when capital can go out very easily, what it means is that you make nation states compete. So if South Korea is giving, say, tax-free capital gains, then they will demand that India should also give tax-free capital gains. Not only nation states are being made to compete with each other, even states within the nations are being made to compete. So if Andhra Pradesh gives a concession, then Gujarat has to give that same concession, or the Tamil Nadu has to give the same concession to compete. Recently, we saw how the Foxconn Vedanta deal that suddenly from Maharashtra went to Gujarat. There was political pressure also, but there was also competition in terms of giving resources, making resources available. The new deal with the Micron company, where a huge amount of funds are being given by the central government and the state government to set up the fab plant that is being set up in Gujarat. So all this has led to weakening of the national governments. And when the national governments weaken, then the control of international finance capital becomes much stronger. And when that becomes stronger, it's very difficult to get out of the grip of that kind of a thing. So in a sense, apart from China, other countries have not been able to keep an independent line. China has very systematically maintained a very independent line on the economic front and on the political and the military front. which other developing world nations have not been able to do. And that's why when you say that the Indian elite want to globalize with the global elite, they don't want to globalize with the Indian common people. So the emotional attraction is towards the West. So West has been the sort of a pole star towards which the elite from the developing world have gravitated. And that's why policy making also takes that into account, and that makes it easier for the advanced countries to manipulate policies in the developing world.
But should we change that policy? I mean, should we have a better recognition of that? That's a very powerful statement that you said, because Indian elite are aligned with the West.
Your voice broke. I could not make out. Your voice is broken. Hello?
Taking the, oh, I think there was an internet disruption. Okay, now can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, now you made a powerful statement that the elite are taking the country towards, for their interest, taking the country towards aligning with the West. And isn't that a very flawed national strategy? Shouldn't we be looking at our own independence and sovereignty in decision making while keeping the international realities in mind? And has China done better than what we've done in this area?
Yes. So that strategy that our elite have followed, in fact, it was very interesting that in my Indian economy book, I've discussed this, that while we were in a strategic alliance with the Soviets, the elite wanted to actually go to the West. So there was a contradiction in the policy that was there, that while for military reasons and for economic reasons, we were allying with the Soviets, for actually other reasons, we wanted to ally with the Western powers. And this contradiction has been playing itself out in the Indian context. And I dare say this has been also there in the case of the other developing world countries, where the elites have aligned themselves with the Western elites and tried to follow their model rather than their own independent model. It is only Gandhi who suggested that we need an Indian modernity rather than copy the Western modernity. So right from the time of independence, we have been trying to copy the Western modernity. So the idea was that there is a bus that is going rapidly and we jump onto it. And that was that we, just copy the Western modernity. Now, that model of development was not appropriate for India. The model of development, of top-down, trickle-down was self-serving model for the Indian elite, because it allowed them to develop by saying that later on the fruits of development will also trickle down to the common people. Now that trickle down has been negligible or very small, and therefore the gap between the well-off and the poor, that has constantly expanded. And this has actually created a huge problem for the Indian economy, Indian politics, and Indian society. That, you have this a twin thing of one segment doing very well, the other segment languishing, and that kind of has created a problem. This problem, I think, has been there in large number of other developing countries as well, because the elite has been self-serving, and the West was very happy with this kind of a policy because it meant that its hold over the policy makers in the developing world was very strong. So all this, how will that change? That's the question. Only if the common people begin to understand that their interest is not being served, only then is it possible that through political changes, you could have a change in policy. But I think that's far from at the moment, because all the political parties in India are following exactly the same policies that are being followed by the ruling party at the moment. So in a sense, I don't see any big change coming in terms of this, where we begin to think of our strategic interest. So in my book, what I've argued is that in India, the consensus among the different groups ruling in India, that consensus that existed at the time of independence, that consensus started breaking down very soon in the 50s and the 60s. And each of these groups started to play its own role and to work for its own benefit, which was a very narrow kind of a thing. So it wasn't a national goal that was being served. It was, sectional interests that were being served. And that's why we're in a situation where today the common people don't believe in the political class. They don't believe in the promises of the political class that things will turn around, that everything would be fine. They say, what are you going to give me today? And that's why the culture where, you offer 6,000 rupees to farmers, you offer, gas cylinders, you offer various things, because the people are saying, what am I going to get today? I'm not going to wait for another 70 years. We waited 70 years and we waited and we have not got much. So give us something today. And that is setting back economic policy and other politics in the country. So it's caught us into a bind, from which to get out is proving to be difficult, because people will not believe in what the government says or the political parties say about India serving its strategic long-term interest. So we need
economic sovereignty, right? That's right.
So sovereignty has to be regained. That sovereignty regaining has become much more difficult because the people now don't believe that the government will work in their interest.
But the BRICS seems to be actually, although India seems to be sitting on the fence, the BRICS story, if you really look into it carefully, has evolved thanks to maybe a bigger role by China in terms of establishing institutions, the New Development Bank as an alternative to the World Bank, the Contingency Reserve Fund as an alternative to the IMF. And they are actually, while they started off with dollar-denominated, funding, but now they are in a position to actually make a change. And I think this agenda for introducing a BRICS currency is not a spur of the moment decision. I think it's been in the making for the last decade and a half. And from what I understand is this BRICS currency will be linked to the gold standard, but not unlike in the past where it will go along with the dollar, and dollars, is valued in a certain quantity of gold, and the BRICS currency will piggyback on the dollar and take full advantage without actually bearing the brunt of, the variations that would be affecting the dollar. And therefore, some of the Western analysts see this as the real, well thought out strategy that's going to pose a challenge. So in a conference where I, attended a panel discussion on BRICS, and I actually mentioned that BRICS is a change agent for the new world order. Here was an American professor from the UCLA who dismissed it, saying that the BRICS are fanciful dreams that they are actually putting together just because Jim O'Neill coined that term and they don't have a future. But today, I think much of the West is alarmed by the rapid developments that's happening in the BRICS. As the summit gets underway, there are 23 applications for full membership. There are 40 countries that have expressed interest in joining the BRICS. And what does that tell in the context of de-dollarisation being accelerated?
We've had groupings like the non-aligned movement earlier. In the WTO, we've had groupings, so that we can take on the challenge of the West. But till now, they have not been successful in terms of taking on the economic challenge. Non-aligned movement managed to take on the, say, political and the strategic challenge up to a point. But I think the economic challenge could not be taken on. Because, unless you follow policies that are, in the interest of the nations themselves, then only will you be able to take on the challenge. If you are only going to follow the trade pattern that is developed by the West, then they will dominate it. So in the WTO also, even though we managed to get certain concessions because we managed to get a grouping, but bulk of it actually went to the Western powers, to the advanced countries. It's only when China became stronger that the Chinese could take advantage of something like WTO after they joined WTO. And that's why China has become the largest trading partner in the world, because it could develop that. And it also had the technology and the strategic vision to actually do that. Now, in BRICS also, I see China dominating. It's the Chinese domination and the Chinese vision that I think BRICS will play out. They have the capacity, they have the reserves, they have the funds, they have the economic might to be able to actually propel BRICS forward. But India is wary of that because India does
Isn't
not.
it a fact that China alone cannot, run the show? They need India. Without India, BRICS will be dead as well. Just Russia and China together cannot run BRICS. And if they want to challenge the economic architecture that has been dominated by the West, India has to be part of this entire process. So it has to be, and the BRICS concept right from the beginning has been equal partnership, irrespective of how much weight each one brings in terms of financial capabilities on the table.
No, you're right in theory that everybody has equal weight, etc. Like for instance, in the IMF also and the World Bank also, they're voting shares and vote shares are there. It's sort of made to look democratic. But I think let's be clear that the economic power matters. What do you bring to the table in terms of your reserves, in terms of your trade, in terms of your strategic goals, etc. And I think India has not been able to take a clear line in terms of its own strategic interests. And that's why we are on both sides. We are also part of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And, we are at the sideline of it because, China again dominates that. So I think in the BRICS also, we are part of it and we'll probably remain there. But I think we are not really in the central this thing. You know that in RCEP, we went to sign RCEP and on the last day, we backed out because we realized that China would dominate RCEP. So look at the disadvantage that India has. We trade with the same nations and we don't get the access which we would have got if we were in RCEP. But if we were in RCEP, we'd be under the Chinese domination.
We have actually sort of failed to be part of any multilateral groupings on finance cooperation.
Yes.
That's true.
Yes. So, and that's because, whenever we've gone in for these trade agreements, we've ended up coming out the worst. So the trade agreements have not really helped us. And that's why our trade agreement with the British has been in discussion for a long time. We're not able to finalize it because we are not able to define our interest clearly. We're not able to get our interest resolved from those countries. And I think the weakness is technology. We lack the technology. China is exporting to us our cultural symbols, like, Ganesh ki murti and, other things like, kites and manja and, the gulal and the pichkari and the Diwali lights. They're able to produce that on scale cheaper than our small scale industry does and sell it to us cheaper. So they've dominated a lot of this and they also dominated high technology. For instance, they've developed 5G technology. And that 5G technology is better than Ericsson and others. So the US is worried. So it keeps saying that those technologies have, hidden bugs in it, and therefore people should not use it. So for security reasons, Britain, India, etc., not using the Huawei technology, which is cheaper and probably better. They've also in APIs, they dominate in APIs. India by 2002, 2003 was 80% self-sufficient in APIs. Now 80% of our APIs are imported from China. So our pharmaceutical industry now depends on Chinese imports, our automobile industry, our electronics industry. So we have a $70-80 billion trade deficit with China. So even though China is, sort of threatening us at our borders, we're trying to reduce trade with them, but the trade is continuing to increase because, they have got the technology, they've got skill. So what India's problem and the problem of much of the developing world is on technology front. That's why the final point I made was that technology is a huge challenge. And now with the new technologies that are coming, artificial intelligence and the chat GPT and so on and so forth, the challenges are going to increase further. And we don't have the capacity at this point to develop those technologies rapidly because our R&D expenditure is very low. So at 0.7%, China is spending 3% of GDP on R&D, and its economy is 5 times bigger. So they're spending 15 times more on R&D than India is doing. So in a sense, this is the strategic challenge. The strategic challenge in India is how do we define our national interest and get the sovereignty to actually implement those policies? That is something that we have not been able to do successfully. We keep on changing our policy. For instance, on R&D, we keep on changing policies, Now, R&D requires a stable policy for a long run because R&D is the most risky investment. So if you keep on changing policy, then nothing much will come out of R&D. So in India, the private sector is not investing in R&D. The public sector invests some amount of money in the R&D, but that also has not gone very far. So we have lagged behind in R&D, whereas as a large nation, we need to spend on R&D. We need to have independence. That's the only way we can have independence, or sovereignty can be regained. So our national attempt should be to do that, to develop our internal strengths, technological strengths. That's the only strategic way we can do. Then the other thing is that in India, there's too much strife at the moment. And when you have a lot of strife, investments suffer. So we have to have a more peaceful environment for investments to rise. Now, that requires national strategic understanding of how we move on that front. So there are, I think, strategic challenges that India faces.
Let me invite the audience to raise their hands and put up those who want to ask questions. And I just, before I ask a last question and then open out to the audience after this. So, Professor, India's position is, is not a very enviable position because of the facts that you actually explained. While China is the largest trading partner, both in terms of exports and imports, to 60 countries, as against US being the largest trading partner for 30 countries. That is the kind of growth China has achieved. So we have a lot of ground to cover in terms of manufacturing, in terms of research and development, in terms of technology. And therefore, we really cannot go full bore towards the de-dollarization process. So in that context, indirectly, while we go along with the BRICS, probably will be in a subdued, process. Then we'll maintain more of a silence and go along with the overall BRICS decision. So that is what I see as happening. But one final question is with respect to central banks. The US is a capitalist society where profit maximization, as a culture overrides everything else. And the central bank of the US, which the dollarization and de-dollarization process, central banks will play a major role ultimately. The central bank of the US Federal Reserve is a private structure, while most other private structures like Bank of England have all been nationalized. Many of the rest of the world, they consider virtually in practical terms, the Federal Reserve acts as the central bank of the world. Will that role be challenged anytime in the future, or that's still over-dominant position of the US, which helps the dollar to remain firm?
You want an answer now?
Okay, later. Let's ask the questions from the audience. Anybody? Okay, we have a question from Mr. Ravi Rao. How realistic is the vision of India becoming the third largest economy in the world?
Should I answer now or should I...
You can answer now, no problem.
Okay. So thanks, Ravi, for asking that question. The question is, are we the fifth largest economy at the moment? Since demonetization, you can see that the rate of growth of the Indian economy is not being fully represented by our GDP data. You could see that during the demonetization process, the markets were empty. Agriculture suffered because produce could not come out to the market. Flowers, vegetables, fruits, etc. And yet the government says that the highest rate of growth for the decade was during demonetization. Now, my own understanding is that what it is reflecting is only the organized sector growth, but the decline in the unorganized sector is not reflected in the data. So actually, the economy declined during that year 2016-17 rather than rise at 8.1%, which is what the government says. So our official data has not been correct. Our economy has been growing at not more than 1, 2, 3% in the last 7 years. And during the pandemic, of course, it declined. Even officially, the rate of growth declined from 2017-18 Q4 at 8% to the last quarter before the pandemic. That's 2019-20 Q4 to 3.2%. So the official rate of growth itself was declining. And if you include the unorganized sector separately, then it had turned negative. So the economy is still the 8th or the 9th largest economy, not the 5th largest economy. Now, post the pandemic, The recovery is in the organized sector, not in the unorganized sector. And you have enough examples of that. For instance, in the FMCG sector, Hindustan Unilever says that our market share is expanding with the small scale sector declining. In the pressure cooker industry, the same statement from Mr. Jagannathan, of the chairman of the pressure cooker industry. Similarly, in the textile sector, leather goods sector, you look at the retail trade, for instance, e-commerce has increased dramatically, 20, 30, 40%, and that has been at the expense of the local traders, the neighborhood stores. So again, the organized sector has expanded at the expense of the unorganized sector. So unorganized sector has been declining, and therefore our rate of growth at the moment cannot be more than 1 or 2%. And therefore, from the 8th or 9th, we are not the 5th largest. And therefore, we are not going to be the 3rd largest in another 5 years, as is being claimed. So the data is a problem because the unorganized sector is not measured independently. And if the unorganized sector is not measured independently, then this is the problem. Okay.
Okay. We have a question from Kalyani. What are the potential challenges for emerging economies in a world where there is a decline of the supremacy of the US dollar? And another question from Harendra Panda. So how can the 5th largest economy be related with the poverty of our country? So you can take on these two and then we'll...
Yeah, I think they are in the chat probably, right?
Yeah, they're in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. So the first question was, what are the potential challenges for emerging economies in our world? So as I said, the potential challenges that we are facing in the world are that uncertainty is growing. When uncertainty grows, then investments decline. And when investment decline, the rate of growth goes down. As the de-dollarization process takes place, the uncertainties will only grow further. And therefore, the emerging economies, as I said in my brief presentation, will have to go for internal, growth patterns rather than depend on external growth patterns. So, for instance, in India, we'd have to increase the purchasing power of the unorganized sector. The unorganized sector is 94% of the employment. Organized sector is only 6%. And the recent data that came from the e-Shram portal, which the government set up, where 28 crore people registered, as unorganized sector workers, and 94% of them said that they earn less than 10,000 rupees per month. Now, the 10,000 rupees per month is close to the poverty line because the World Bank poverty line is $2.15 per person per day, which translates to 26,000 rupees for a family of 5 per month. Now, this is in PPP terms divided by 3, and you get to a figure of about 9,000 rupees or so. So in other words, these 28 crore people who are registered, of which 94% say they earn less than 10,000 rupees, they're around the poverty line. So consumption and the demand is very low. And that has been further affected by the high inflation rate. So unless we give purchasing power to these people, the demand in the economy will not rise. If the demand doesn't rise, then the growth rate will not revive. So therefore, we have to depend on internal sources of strength, which is that we have to improve the consumption, the purchasing power in the hands of the vast majority of the public. If we do that, then there would be a revival and we would be able to face the problems that would be posed by the de-dollarization that is taking place in the world. If we remain connected to the outside world in the manner in which we have, then the de-dollarization will impact us very strongly. We will not be able to face the challenge. So internal strength is what we need to actually get to. Then I think the next question is the 5th largest economy and poverty of our country. So as I said, we are not the 5th largest economy. We are still probably the 8th or the 9th largest. Recently, the data came from what's called the multi-dimensional poverty index that the Niti Aayog put out, which said that 135 million Indians actually went above the poverty line in 2019 to 21 as compared to 2015-16. Now, imagine how can poverty have reduced during 2020-21, which was the pandemic year, when we know the large number of people lost incomes, work stopped, the GDP declined very sharply during that period, and schools were closed, and the health facilities were creaking. Large number of people were not able to get health facility in the semi-rural areas and the rural areas. In the cities also, the best of the cities that we have, Bombay, Delhi, people were dying outside hospitals, in the ambulances, etc. Now, multidimensional poverty index depends on health, education, and living standard. Now, in all three, we declined during 2020-21. So how could multidimensional poverty have reduced by 135 million compared to 2015-16? When children could not go to school, that is one of the measures. When health, and the deaths, we could not count all the deaths, even as the data seems to suggest. So multidimensional poverty, which is supposed to have reduced by 135 million, I don't buy that. I think the poverty increased during the, pandemic. And, government had to give 10 kilo of ration to the public, 5 kilo under the Food for Work and 5 kilo under the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, So it's this 10 kilo of ration that helps sustain at least the basics for these people. But that didn't mean that they rose above the poverty line. Employment did not rise, employment fell, and that's why a large number of people migrated from urban to rural areas. They demanded work under the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And the RBI data shows that people got only 47 days of work. So for a family of 5, you are allowed 100 days of work under the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and you are getting only 47 days. Now, can a family survive on 47 days of work in the year? Okay, under the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So in other words, employment was very low and incomes had fallen. So how could poverty have declined? So I don't buy this idea that, poverty has declined in the country. Poverty remains quite large in the country. And if you go by the socio-economic survey of the Delhi government in 2018, now remember, Delhi has a 3 times the per capita income of the nation. And the data from the Delhi socio-economic survey showed that 90% of the families in Delhi spend less than 25,000 rupees per month, and 98% spend less than 50,000 rupees. Now, if you divide that by 2.5 for the nation, then it comes to 90% of the families in the country are spending less than 10,000 rupees per month, and 98% are spending less than 20,000 rupees per month. Now, if you believe this, that this Delhi socio-economic survey was correct, then it suggests that 98% are really lower middle class and the poor, and only 2% are the upper income groups. So therefore, poverty could not have declined, and this is 2018, before the pandemic. So during the pandemic, things would have become much worse. And also, if you look at it, the tax data, direct tax data shows that even though about 7 to 8 crore people file return, but as the Prime Minister said from the rampart of the Red Fort, that only 1.5 crore are effective taxpayers. So that means only 1.1% of Indians are effectively paying direct taxes. So it's a very tiny number that's paying direct taxes. And that, is an indication of how few people are in the tax net, in the direct tax net.
Hmm.
Then I think there's a thing on...
There are quite a few questions. You can read that? Yeah.
BRICS common currency, how can purchasing power be given? So as I said, for Ravi's question of purchasing power, we need to give incomes at the lower levels by creating employment. And it's possible to generate enough employment in the country if we focus on agriculture and on the micro sector. Micro sector employs 97.5% of the MSME employment. And that sector has been hit very hard. And agriculture, which employs 46% of the workforce, that has been hit very hard. So if we give buoyancy to agriculture and to the micro sector, we can generate enough employment, and that will give purchasing power in the hand of these 94% who are in the unorganized sector. Then the question about BRICS, overcome the obstacles might be coming from the US in future. So, definitely the US will put obstacles as far as the alternate currency is concerned. and the diplomatic engagement between China and India on a common platform, I think that is going to be rather difficult at this point of time. Where I think the positions in China and India have hardened. And this, some kind of, like during Rajiv Gandhi's regime, there was a breakthrough in the diplomatic relations. I think we need some kind of a breakthrough in diplomatic relations. But I think the West would not like that. And therefore, it may prove to be difficult given the internal dynamics of the Indian government at the moment, where, this kind of diplomatic easing may prove to be difficult. But I think that's the need of the hour. We do need to come to some kind of agreement on our border with China. And once that happens, I think greater collaboration can take place between China and India, which would be mutually beneficial. But I don't think the West would like it and would play a role in seeing that doesn't happen. As India's backing for the common currency, if common currency is created up, did the common currency affect the... No, at the moment, there's no common currency in India's trade with China. We are still wanting to trade in rupees. And I think the Russians are not very happy with that because they have a huge surplus. We are buying a lot of oil from Russia. So how would that surplus be managed? That becomes the issue. Because if the rupee keeps depreciating...
In fact, the Russian foreign minister... In fact, the Russian foreign minister Lavrov, a few months back, he actually made a comment. We have billions of rupees. We can't use all that, which is a reflective of India's inability to export adequately what the Russians want. And that, again, is a reflection of the inadequacy of the manufacturing sector. We are only at 14%, 13% of the GDP of the manufacturing sector. Yes, Professor.
So, manufacturing is one aspect, but our services trade is also there. But even there, we're not able to penetrate into, supplying more to the Russians. And that is the problem that will take place when the dollar is replaced, because till now, at least, India, Russia could, denominate in dollars. We could exchange dollars and do that. But now that's not possible because Russian reserves have been frozen by the Americans. And therefore, we have to work out some kind of alternate arrangements. At one point of time, it was even said that maybe the Chinese currency may be acceptable, but India would not like that, because that would then make India dependent more on the Chinese economy. As it is, our dependence on China is very high. So India may not like to see that happening. So this trade between different nations in an alternate currency, that is going to pose a challenge for some time. And as that poses a challenge, we will not be able to replace in the world of finance, dollar by other currencies. And that's what is slowing down the de-dollarization. So we have to make the effort, both in strategic terms as well as in financial terms, to see that, alternate arrangements are made, which are more stable. So we could have a basket of currencies. If there are, say, 10 currencies or 10 or 20 countries which are getting together under BRICS, and we form some kind of a basket of currencies. That basket could be one possible way of trading with each other using that basket of currency. But in that basket also China would dominate, because China dominates in terms of trade. So that's something that, again, India may be wary of, but India may have to accept that for the moment. But that would not be liked by the Western powers, and they would try and undermine that by applying pressure on the countries that join BRICS. What will be the change for a country like India if dollar is replaced by any other currency, be it BRICS or any other currency? So, as I was saying, change, in the short run, if you try and replace the dollar by other currencies, uncertainty will go up. And as uncertainty goes up, trade will be affected, financial movements will be affected, and investment would be affected. So these kind of effects we'll have to tackle by developing internal strengths. And the internal strengths, as I said, we have to control our unemployment situation. We have to generate more jobs, create more demand in the economy, so that our economy can expand. At the moment, after demonetization, our economy is hardly expanding. When we begin to expand more, we'll be able to develop strengths within the Indian economy, which would then be able to help us to withstand the pressures that will come from outside. At the moment, I think we're not able to withstand the pressures that come from outside. So I think it's a strategic thing that we have to do. Why India restrains from letting its currency fully convertible without any restrictions? We have been thinking of convertibility. The Narsimham Committee report in 96 suggested that, then again in 2006. But, we got saved. Because if we had convertible currency in 96, as this committee's report suggested, then, as the contagion came in Southeast Asia in 97, our currency would have also sunk very dramatically. The only currency that didn't sink was the Malaysian currency, because Malaysia completely banned capital export, during that. And it was criticized by the IMF and the US. But later on, the same IMF and the US praised Malaysia for banning convertibility. Other Southeast Asian nations did not stop convertibility, and they suffered enormously. So, only when you have your internal strength can you do convertibility. Otherwise, what will happen is capital movements will be very large, especially, the speculative movements. And that will then mean that the currency will decline. You saw that in 1991, when the Indian currency was going down, large amount of flow of capital took place from India to the West through the black economy route, etc. So even when you don't have convertibility, you get affected by large capital movements. So Indian economy doesn't have the strength to be able to withstand that. Not only that, even say a country like France in 83, when President Mitterrand came to power, he was a socialist. He tried to change things, but there was so much capital movement out of France that within 3 days he had to reverse policies. Similarly, in South Africa, when Mandela came, Mandela also tried to change things, and within 1 month he had to reverse policies because of capital flight. So, developing country like India, if we open up to convertibility, we open up to massive capital flight and massive movements of currency, which can destabilize our economy. Because if the rupee starts weakening rapidly, then inflation in India will kick up, because all imports will become more expensive, and when that happens, then, your currency will weaken further. So therefore, in a sense, it is not the right stage that we can move towards capital account convertibility. We already have the LRS scheme, the liberalized remittance scheme. And if you see, quite a lot of capital is going out through the liberalized remittance scheme. So on the one hand, we are saying we are short of capital and we need to give concession to capital to invest in India. On the other hand, we are allowing capital to go abroad, both through the black economy route and the legal liberalized remittance scheme. So in a sense, we have a contradiction in terms of policy.
Professor, China is still not fully convertible, correct? Given their strong position, they haven't gone for full convertibility.
No, they haven't.
Okay, I think we are coming to the end of our session. It's been a wonderful session with you. Let me request your concluding remarks before we start winding up.
Yes. So, my concluding remark is that India has to get its act together. If we don't get our act together internally, then we'll suffer in the global situation. And getting our act together means our education, which is the base for your development of knowledge, for development of R&D. R&D expenditures have to go up, and the impending challenges that are there of artificial intelligence, which is going to displace large number of people from employment, that's going to weaken India. So we need to take on that challenge from now. And if cryptos come, then, the de-dollarisation may take place very rapidly. Because even though cryptos may be denominated in dollars, but they'll tend to replace currencies, and they'll tend to weaken banks, they'll weaken the central banks, and that will pose a huge challenge for the global financial architecture. So if cryptos come, that'll pose another level of challenge. Artificial intelligence is posing another level of challenge. The climate change is posing yet another level of challenge. So with all these challenges coming in the coming years, we have to get our act together if we are to be strategically well placed to face the global challenge.
Thank you, Professor. This is, of course, we could have carried on for much longer time. There are many areas still to be covered as well. For example, the issues related to internal and external debt and the dollar, domination. The BRICS currency, as it comes up, it's also being talked about by some experts in the context of what Keynes proposed in 1944 for a world currency, which the US declined at that point of time. And the model that's been discussed is also being looked at from that model, and how will that be? And as you also raised the issue of cryptocurrencies, most central banks are now moving towards digital currencies, are looking at particularly the Chinese and how that's going to impact. There are many developments that are taking place, but one thing for sure is de-dollarization is certainly underway. It's going to take another 2 decades by the time we see the real phase of what the global financial architecture is going to be. But as you said, India has a lot of work to do. And independent decisions is certainly the most important thing that India has to take, rather than go along with somebody else. In national interest, I think we need to look at economic sovereignty as the fulcrum of our entire strategic thought process. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful evening with you. And let me hand over to Adya for the word of thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Yes. Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful talk. It was very enlightening and thought-provoking, in a way, giving the real picture of the current geopolitical situation. This brings us to the end of today's conversation. I take immense pleasure in proposing the vote of thanks. I would like to thank Air Marshal Dr. Matheswaran for having taken up this topic and bringing in an eminent speaker, Professor Arun Kumar, for our community, especially our interns and other enthusiasts. Thank you, sir. I would like to express our sincere thanks to Professor Arun Kumar for having taken up his valuable time to be with us and bring about an erudite work on de-dollarization. It really was an enlightening peroration, and I'm very sure those who have been here to listen to your talk has been benefited multifold in understanding the core subject of your speech. Thank you very much, sir. We look forward to having you with us very soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience for raising very good questions. We look forward once again.
Thank you all once again for taking time and joining us today. See you all soon.
Thanks. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Professor. Thank you all the audience.
Recording stopped.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.